My grandmother, in particular, told me whenever you saw a shooting star or a falling star, it was a poor person's soul going to the other place.
Poor
Poor person's soul going to the other place.
What other place?
Hell. As opposed to the nice place. So, but you were supposed to then say a prayer. Now, for years, I thought what she meant by poor person was somebody like us, poor, no money, as opposed she meant the people who weren't believers, unfortunate people, not physically poor people.
Right.
So I'm convinced I was going to hell solely because I was poor. But you were supposed to say a, Hail Mary sort of thing.
When you saw them.
When you saw the shooting star.
Right, okay.
Because you know how Catholics believe in purgatory.
Faye and Paddock, I know this time see very much you need to have along the way. Welcome, I'm Faye and this is Conversations with Faye, and my guest today is Donna Burton, or affectionately known as Donna the Astronomer. We're going to find out a little bit about Donna today, where she comes from, how she got to become an astronomer, and so much more. Let's find out what Donna has to say. Welcome, Donna. Thank you for your time. We need to know a little bit about who you are and where you come from and how you became an astronomer. Where did that interest come from? But where do you come from?
So I come from Tupaia these days, in the middle of New South Wales. But prior to that, I lived in Sydney for a little while, but prior to that, my dad was a drover. And I guess that's where I fell in love with the sky.
And what's a drover?
So a drover's a person who moves sheep and cattle, particularly during droughts, and this was in the 60s and 70s drought, between places to get water and get them to things before the big trucks came along and the road, transported by road train, because you could beat them up on the way.
Right.
On what we call the Long Paddock.
The Long Paddock. I know the Long Paddock. Where does the Long Paddock start? Where does it finish? Is it still around?
These days there's stock trails and people use them, but the Long Paddock still exists. And it's right across it's everywhere. Obviously not in the city, but everywhere there's stock trails and things that people are allowed to use.
Right. Okay.
People weren't always that honest. Think of Saltbush Bill in the stories. Okay. My grandfather was a bit like Saltbush Bill. He reckons that in the Saltbush Bill they go, and the hardest day work that he ever did was that he lost the fight. So he kept fighting all day, Saltbush Bill, with the squatter. And while he was doing that, all the sheep spread everywhere and took forever to come back. And that's the sort of thing that my grandfather would have done quite happily.
Okay. So your dad was a drover?
Actually, my granddad, yeah.
As your grandfather was. And do you spend a lot of time out droving with him?
I spent a lot of time on the track with them, yeah.
Okay, what was that like? And what was that experience for you?
I thought it was best ever. I didn't know any different. I hated going back to the city to visit my mum and my grandparents. In fact, I walked into a parking meter once because I was looking up at the big building and noticing two black eyes. It's so embarrassing for my grandmother, who had to take me to the hospital and explain that I hadn't been beaten up. But it's freedom. I didn't have to go to real school. I did School of the Air and correspondence, and I thrived in that environment because I'm fidgety.
Yeah.
Strange that. I didn't do very well at sitting still and paying attention in classes and stuff, which is why even through to my science degree and my master's and everything else I've done in astrophysics has all been done through distance ed.
Right. So as you were growing up, what was it? Your dad was droving and you slept out under the stars all the time.
Yeah.
What was it like? Every day was different?
Well, every day was pretty much the same. Flies and heat and dust and work and animals and smells and then occasionally it rained. It did occasionally rain.
Right. So on the way as you were droving, what sort of people did you meet?
Loads and loads of different people, because this was Dad went back after the Vietnam War, and they just couldn't cope, and a lot of other fellas did as well. They couldn't cope with after what happened and the way people treated them when they came back. They went back. They went bush, and so there were people from all different nationalities. I got a lot of Indigenous kids, which is where my love of Indigenous astronomy comes from, and.
So you spent a lot of time with Indigenous kids, bare feet, running around the bush.
Oh, yeah. If it wasn't politically correct, we were running around with nothing on much, like a native kid.
Nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that.
Mm.
It would have been absolutely total freedom and fun.
Oh, it was. And, you know, I have 4 Irish Catholic grandparents, so I have the superstitions that were drummed into me by Irish Catholic grandparents, and also the experiences as by being with all these other kids who were different stories. And one story is really, I don't know if I've told you this at the other time, about a meteor shower.
No, tell me.
So this was a massive meteor storm. There were thousands of meteors. Now, my grandmother in particular, lovely Irish Catholic lady she was, told me whenever you saw a shooting star or a falling star, it was a poor person's soul going to the other place.
Poor person's
Soul going to the other place.
What other place?
Hell. As opposed to the nice place. So, but you were supposed to then say a prayer. Now, for years, I thought what she meant by poor person was somebody like us, poor, no money, as opposed she meant the people who weren't believers, unfortunate people, not physically poor people.
Right.
So I was convinced I was going to hell solely because I was poor. But you were supposed to say a, Hail Mary sort of thing.
When you saw them.
When you saw the shooting star.
Right, okay.
Because you know how Catholics believe in purgatory,
Oh, yes.
Supper of the dead and all hallows and all that stuff. But this night there was this massive meteor storm. Now, Indigenous people think of them as battles in the sky.
Right.
And they're spears, so they're bad whichever way you look at them. However, and there's another story which I'll tell you the nicest side of it. Anyway, so this massive meteor storm's occurring, and the only trees out there were saltbush. Like, we don't have big trees like you have out here.
Yeah.
So we had little saltbushes. So me and the other Indigenous kids, we're all hiding behind the saltbush thinking the spears that come from the ancestors. Didn't say a single prayer. The next day on the ADC, on the radio that we had, they were talking about all these people who died in flooding of the deltas in Bangladesh. So I felt guilty for years thinking it was my fault they all died. I didn't say a single prayer. But yeah, there's a beautiful Indigenous story that counteracts my grandparents' story. So it's sort of about the Milky Way is sort of like a big camp up there, and Biame, where I come from, is the All Father, the creator, and he lives in a sky camp beyond there.
A sky camp
beyond the Milky Way.
Right, okay.
And when somebody dies, he invites them to the sky camp if they're initiated in that. So they go to the sky camp.
How do they get initiated?
That's part of Aboriginal culture, Indigenous culture.
Right, okay.
So I'll come and what happens to the non-initiated people like me, white fellas. So they go there, and when they arrive there, they send back a meteor, a shooting star, to let their families and friends know they've arrived safely. Now, that is so much nicer than my grandparents' stories. Don't you think?
Yes.
Much, much nicer.
Yes.
But, so if you're not initiated or you're a kid, because you're a kid or you're a white fella, you go back to the Magellanic Clouds, which are Barney's wives, to be reborn as spirit babies and have another go.
Oh, really? Okay. Tell me more. What was it like playing with the Indigenous kids? What sort of things?
Any difference?
What sort of things? I'm fascinated because I want to know what you learned from them, because they would have had these a culture that had just this natural way of learning and doing things and surviving.
So you learned a lot. So basically you were sort of had many uncles.
Right.
Many parents and many uncles. And so you sort of learned, and they weren't just Indigenous, there were Polish people, Chinese people, Arabs, Afghan type people. There were people from all different walks of life. And there were a lot of, obviously, Europeans as well, who were very educated, but didn't cope. They'd been conscripted, so they didn't cope very well. And yeah, so you learn all different things. And so you sort of had these multiple teachers of different things. And so you're sort of one of the kids. So I learned a lot about surviving in the bush and that. But I also saw things that it's really hard to explain as a scientist.
Right.
Like how the old fellas could sing into the fire, could look into the fire and get messages and know what was happening thousands of kilometres away, that somebody had died. And then they'd all go walkabout to the funeral.
So they'd look into the fire.
And they had some sort of, I can't explain it, but they could share knowledge.
In the fire.
By the fire. Yeah.
Wow.
And we knew about singing and pointing the bones and things like that and how they worked. And it's obviously, these days of science, I can see it's mind over matter. It's you believe you're going to die, therefore you die.
Yeah.
You give up. And it's very powerful magic in that sense, as in using the term magic in that sense that it's powerful stuff because you believe it. And so it happens. And even white fellas can die from it. And so I learned a lot of stuff like that. Good stuff too. I learned to be able to read the stars and read the weather and things as well. Which is where I felt as a kid. And I mean, you learn from because the old time farmers did that as well. You know, the halo around the moon, the different types of clouds, the calmness if you were near water.
Right.
Whether the moon was hazy or not.
Right.
Whether the stars twinkled high or low. Whether they were colourful twinkling.
You learned all this as a kid.
You just absorb the knowledge.
Right.
I'm a sponge.
Yes, I know you are.
And so I absorb stuff. And and you come back and you think about it when you're an adult and you understand so much better. You can't explain it all.
Yes.
Certainly I can't explain a lot of the more magic stuff, for lack of a better word. I can't think of a better word.
But you have an appreciation for their culture and their ability to see things that we actually don't see now and survive
in a very unforgiving land.
Yes. Yes.
And they knew where water was. They had, they can, the things they're called songlines. They're related to the stars in the sky, but they're not like a map. They're like a mind thing, like a memory aid.
Right.
So each star, say in the Scorpion and Sagittarius, for example, they have a meaning. They have a story or a song related to them.
Right.
Or a story. So you'd learn the story and relate to where water might be found or where you turn to go somewhere. Different things like that. So to travel you throughout the country.
Wow.
And you learn like when, say, the Seven Sisters, the Pleiades, as we know, when it rises in May, June, that meant that was the beginning of a different season. So this winter, so there'd be time to move on and from different parts and where different food sources would be available. And it's really hard to explain, but you just absorbed it.
Yeah.
You didn't think about it. It's just like my lessons. I absorbed mathematics like it was magic.
Mathematics is not magic.
I just liked English intensely. I couldn't learn languages. I just wasn't interested.
Yeah.
Whereas I was interested in history and geography and science and math. I still to this day struggle with English. When I got my thesis back, most of the corrections were jolly grammar and, those two dots and commas and all those
exclamation marks and all that sort of stuff.
I really think they should be banned. You should be able to write sentences without them, like short sentences, so it doesn't matter.
I agree.
But, of course, what's really hilarious is these days when I'm talking to young people, I'm saying, okay, they ask what they need to study at school. I'm saying, I'm sorry, you really do need to study English because your whole life is publish or perish.
Yes.
It's all about that. So English is suddenly fundamentally more important even than your math because you have to be able to communicate. And I do regret my total dislike of it, and I have great respect for English teachers now.
But you do very well regardless. So how old were you when you were a drover's kid?
Yeah. Oh, my dad called me the drover's brat.
The drover's brat.
He used to introduce me as, this is my daughter, she's a drover's brat, won't become a doctor. Well, I could die of embarrassment sometimes with the way my dad would carry on. Now he's passed on now, so he passed on. And he died on the day of the transit of Venus in 2012. And I told him not to die that day because he was in hospital in Queensland. I had major events because the transit of Venus in 2012 was the last one in our lifetime because it won't be another one for next century. And so I had all this stuff happening and I really needed to be concentrating on it. So what does he do?
Goes and dies on you.
Goes and dies. At 9 o'clock in the morning, and my sister's never on a ring out wanting me to sort everything out. And I said, I don't want to talk about it. I told him not to die. He was not allowed to die today. So I'm going to deal with everything and I'll deal with that problem tomorrow. But I'll never forget the transit of Venus of 2012.
No, you won't. And what's the transit of Venus 2012? What is it?
So Venus goes in front of the sun. So if you remember any of your history, Captain Cook came down here.
Yes.
Because he was actually going in 1768 to observe the transit of Venus in Tahiti. So these things happen like 8 years apart and then don't happen for another 120 plus years. So they're very, very rare events, and they've been used to measure the distance of us to the sun. And from a scientific point of view, they're really important. And in 1760, they sent people out and they sort of messed it up a bit. 1768 was the next big one. There were expeditions right across the world looking at Venus, because you can measure the time it took Venus to go across the sun. You could measure the distance. You could just do so much geometry and trigonometry.
And that's where the mathematics comes in.
And that's where it gets really interesting. And we reproduced the experiments that they did in 1768 and 2012.
Right.
And then there'll been one in 2004 as well. And so we were broadcasting to the world because we actually had reasonably clear weather for the rest of the world.
Right.
And these were the days where internet was still slow in 2012. We didn't have fast internet on the mountain. We actually ran out of bandwidth because we were one of the few places, and the ABC was rebroadcasting us, and so we just ran out of bandwidth and had to buy more bandwidth. It was really hilarious, but the things that you don't think about.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the transit of Venus was actually really, really important in Australian history, because after he finished the transit of Venus, he went to New Zealand as a lieutenant. He was only a lieutenant then, by the way.
Okay, not a captain.
Not a captain then, yeah. Went to New Zealand to Mercury Bay, where he looked at the transit of Mercury, and then of course his secret orders were to come and try and find the great big Terra Australis Incognita, the southern land.
Say that again.
Well, Australia was called Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown South Land.
Right.
That's all it means. Australia just means south.
South.
Yes. Yeah. There's
we are south,
the Southern Lights.
Yes. Yes.
Cook was just a lieutenant on the Endeavour expeditions, the 1768 one, and so he did the transit of Venus in Tahiti in 1768, and that was an adventure within itself. And they recorded. He had an astronomer on board called Charles Green, which is an interesting character as well. He would later die of syphilis.
All right.
Side effects in Batavia, and he went a bit mad on the way, but he was a brilliant astronomer. And so was Cook.
Right.
Cook was probably the world's greatest cartographer or map maker.
Really?
And he would use from an astronomy point of view, he used Jupiter's moons because he didn't have Harrison's clock. Hadn't been made freely available because it was super expensive and had just been approved as a way of finding longitude. And longitude was the biggest problem in navigation in that time. But Cook would use Jupiter's moons to work out his longitude. And so longitude is your east-west position. So finding north and south was easy. You measure a star above the horizon. Latitude was easy to work out. But longitude, which is a measurement of time. So the Earth's divided 24 hours, time zones and all of that. It's about 40,000 kilometres around, divided up. So each segment you've got there. And so what he would do is he'd take, wherever they landed, they'd take a telescope ashore and their pendulum clock ashore, because pendulum clocks didn't work well on ships. Because pendulums go, and ships go, it doesn't work really well, so you're losing time. And keeping time was a really big problem. And so he'd take it aside and he'd look at Jupiter's moons. And so what they had, so from the mid-17th century, so the telescope was about 1610 when Galileo looked through it all. So by Cassini's time in about 1650, they actually had identified that Jupiter's moons went in a regular pattern.
In a regular pattern?
Just like we go in a regular pattern around the sun, we follow Kepler's laws. And so you can predict where the planets are at any given time, and they could do that then. Jupiter's 4 moons that Galileo first saw, the Galilean moons, also went around in predictable times. So they had basically these predictions in an almanac based upon Greenwich, because that's where he sailed out of. So Greenwich now, of course, is the prime meridian, but it wasn't always.
Is that why it's called Greenwich Mean Time?
Yes, now it is. Yeah. And that didn't come until the 1880s, but that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
But so he had these charts of what it would be like, tables of where Jupiter's moons be if he was in Greenwich. And he had the timing, so by taking his clock aside, he'd set it to local noon time based upon when the sun was at its highest. So that's where astronomy all comes into it all. And so the clock could be accurate on the land, and the telescope, he'd look at the moons, and then he'd match them up.
Okay.
So then all you had to do was subtract the time where you were, add or subtract depending on whether you're east or west of Greenwich, to work out what the time in Greenwich was, and then you divide by 15 minutes, and you knew where your longitude was.
Oh,
And so he did this and the maps he made of Australia were so accurate that in 1788, obviously the first fleet came here, but La Perouse was here as well, about the same time. They got here on January 19th, about the same time the first fleet was moving from Botany Bay to Port Jackson.
right.
And there were only 2 ships in La Perouse's expedition and many more in the first fleet. But of course, but neither country knew the other one, that they were both at war again. And as sailors and scientists all got on and everything else, and they shared knowledge and everything else in the time they were both in Australia. But La Perouse had said that the whole reason that he was on this mission was to check Cook's maps out. And he said that all they were doing were basically confirming the accuracy of Cook's maps.
He must have been a highly intelligent man.
Oh,
Yeah.
Oh, he was in so many ways. He actually picked up in Tahiti. He took on board not as a slaver, but as somebody came along with him, Tupaia, who was a priest and a prince and a navigator, a Polynesian navigator, and he would get off, and he showed him how to navigate in the old-fashioned way, and he could always find Tahiti from wherever he was without looking at the charts, and he was always accurate, no matter where they were in the Pacific. But he was also used to communicate with the Maoris in New Zealand, and because the Polynesians have a common background, and that's where they came from, but he couldn't help in Australia because the Indigenous Australians came from Africa via Asia, and they had nothing in common with the Polynesians. So
Yeah.
they didn't have that sort of relationship. But for all the bad things that are said about Cook, he was an incredible man.
Well, I've learned something about him that I didn't know,
So
which is
as an
absolutely
astronomer,
fascinating.
as a navigator, he was the best they had.
Okay, so from your beginnings as a drover's brat, growing up and mixing with many cultures, and the Indigenous culture taught you lots about how they look at the sky and the different information that they get from the sky, which is fascinating in itself.
Yeah, and not just the sky, but the land as
The
well.
land, yes.
And the animals and the insects and how things behave under different conditions.
And what you could eat and what you couldn't eat.
And when rain was coming,
yeah.
Long before the rain got to 3-state, because it didn't rain very often, because it was in the 60s and 70s drought, so there wasn't a lot of rain. But they could tell that the rain was coming long before it got there.
Well, that brings us to the end of the show. Thank you, Donna, for your time. What an incredible conversation, finding out about Donna being called the drover's brat, sleeping under the night sky every night as a child growing up, wandering around the bush, learning about the night sky, learning from the different cultures, particularly the Indigenous people who know how to read the stars, know what the weather's going to be, know when the rain's going to come. She also talked about how Lieutenant Cook, who then became Captain Cook, was a brilliant cartographer, and how he mapped out the longitude and latitude and the north and south with a metronome as well, but not on the ship, only on land. And there was so much more in that. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be back next time with another guest. Donna will come back again and talk more about the night skies. Thank you for watching. I'm Faye, and this has been Conversations with Faye. Bye for now. Hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel, like us on Facebook, and follow us on Instagram. Stay inspired, stay connected, and join our amazing community today.